We've heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, but have you heard of complex post-traumatic stress disorder? If you don't know the difference between the two, and you have actually dealt with prolonged or repeated trauma in your life for either a period of months or a period of years, you can't miss this video. Hey friends, glad to be back. And today we're going to be addressing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We're going to be talking about the difference between that and PTSD. If you haven't seen my previous video on PTSD, please watch that video first before watching this video. The link to that video is in the description below. Okay, let's start talking about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's begin with really focusing on the examples of where C-PTSD can begin with, because I think a lot of times we don't realize or understand exactly where it can come from, and I think this is important. So the first thing that I want to address is childhood neglect. Okay, when someone's been neglected as a child and through a long period of their childhood, right, this is definitely an example of how this can begin. Also, abuse at a very early age. Okay, that's physical, mental, emotional abuse, domestic abuse as well. So if you've been abused by your spouse over a period of time, do you see what I'm saying? That can cause C-PTSD, right? Also, human trafficking, which is an extreme example, but definitely something that we want to talk about as well, because this is affecting more people than we'd like to admit. Right? And so if somebody was sold into human trafficking and had to deal with the situation over and over again, day after day, you can see how there would be a complex PTSD situation that would be different from just a one situation. You see what I'm saying? Also, prisoners of war, which is a good example as well. Definitely not as many people probably dealing with that, but that gives you an example of kind of how this affects somebody and how the situation directly reflects on why this makes it complex instead of just PTSD, okay? And then also living in war regions as well. So I know that it doesn't affect all of us, but there are people around this planet that are having to live in a war-affected region every day of their life, okay? They don't know if there's gonna be bombs going off, they don't know if there's gonna be murders, they don't know what's gonna happen, okay? So think about how they're feeling on a daily basis. They don't know, but they've had some horrible things that they've seen, and it's been consistent and it's prolonged over a certain period of time. So you can see how this is affecting them for a long period of time, which would lead to why it's C-PTSD instead of PTSD. So now let's talk about PTSD and C-PTSD and the similar symptoms that we have here. The first one is a very similar symptom is reliving the trauma. So like I spoke about in the previous video, when you're dealing with PTSD, you're going to relive that trauma. You're going to have probably nightmares, images. It's almost like you're having even flashbacks as well. So those flashbacks are going to seem very, very real. And it's almost going to feel as though you're back in the situation again. Your heart might start racing. You actually might be physically sweating. And you actually might be having fear in the situation or even fear for your life. The next symptom, much like PTSD, is that we want to avoid the situation. So we want to avoid anything that reminds us of our past trauma, the types of people, the activities, the environment, all those things we try to avoid. So we have a lot of avoidance in our life when we're dealing with both of these because we don't want to relive it. We don't want to keep thinking about it. So we want to avoid anything that triggers us into reliving this trauma. One thing that's interesting too that I find with C-PTSD, and it's also there with PTSD, is that when we remember these traumas, we can actually get physically ill. Okay, so as we remember and relive the situation, and we relive this trauma, or we feel it, we might actually feel nauseated, right? We might feel sick, we might feel dizzy, we might even feel like a headache's coming on, but usually that nausea is an indication that we actually feel the trauma so much that it's actually physically affecting us. Another symptom that I found with many clients as well is that they're on constant high alert. They're constantly on high alert, waiting for something to happen, something bad going to happen. It's almost like when you're trying to sleep, you sleep with one eye open, anticipating something to happen that's going to be wrong. And so it can really put you into a state of panic and a fight or flight mode constantly, and the ability to really focus on what needs to happen is almost impossible. So it's constantly just kind of running, and only stopping when you're completely exhausted. And a lot of folks do this too because it's so hard for them to sleep. They literally stay up as long as they can before they actually pass out because they don't want to deal with the nightmares and the trauma that they get at night. Whether we're dealing with PTSD or C-PTSD, we can still have those thoughts like the world is a dangerous place. The world is an unsafe place. I trust no one. I don't trust myself. There's all these different thoughts that come into play. Because when you're dealing with that kind of trauma and that type of abuse, right, it makes you question yourself to the core. And we also have a tendency of turning that on to ourselves. Why were we in the situation? And think about it, if this started happening to you as a child, this type of abuse, you know, a child, we have very black and white thinking as a child. So if you're being abused, I must be a bad child to be treated like this, okay? Something must be wrong with me for me to be treated like this. And so these thoughts start spiraling through your head because there's no way that they would treat a good child and abuse or beat or sexually molest a good child. Do you see what I'm saying? When you obviously know the reality is that unfortunately you were an amazing child, but you were in a horrible situation where people took advantage of you and abused you, right? But when we're children, we don't know that. And so we feel something must be wrong with us for us to be going through this process. And we're being basically schooled or we're being punished for being that bad child. Another indication that we're dealing with PTSD or C-PTSD is difficult sleeping and focusing. And I kind of touched on that earlier. It's really hard to focus when you have all these thoughts of fear in your mind. Okay, when you're reliving trauma, when you feel completely unsafe all the time, and you're worried about everything and everyone, because when you really think about it, the people that were supposed to take care of you or help you in the past did the opposite. And so how can you trust people when you haven't dealt with this? Because you're looking at people and instead of them being helpful, they were predators. Okay, so that takes all the trust right out of a situation, because how can you trust a stranger if you couldn't even trust your parents? And last but not least, when I'm talking about symptoms, I want to talk about loud sounds. Okay, a lot of times when people are dealing with C-PTSD, we get a little fearful, we get a little scared when we hear loud sounds, whether that sounds almost like gunfire or slamming doors or what have you, as well as when people begin to talk really loudly and even angry. Okay, so when somebody's being very angry and speaking very loud, that can cause us to feel some fear, as well as large crowds. Depending on what happened and the situations we're dealing with, we might not be able to feel very comfortable or very safe at all when having to deal with so many people around us. So that's why a lot of times when people are dealing with PTSD or C-PTSD, there's a tendency of retreating, right, and kind of exiting out of the world because of the fear of not trusting other people, but also feeling uncomfortable and kind of feeling out of control when we deal with situations that remind us of the trauma or just put us in a fear factor where we feel like we can't trust or control the situation. So let's talk about help now. If you feel like you're dealing with complex PTSD, first off, you want to be able to connect and have some solid connections with either family or friends. If you don't have that family component and they're part of the problem, hopefully you have some friends that you can communicate with and trust, as well as that friend dynamic, and having that, hopefully you also can find a good therapist or life coach to work with, where you can work with CBT therapy, so cognitive behavioral therapy, and really working to understand those negative thoughts in those situations and also those thought patterns to either change those to positive or at least neutral. But not just that, being able to talk through the trauma and understand the symptoms, the beginning, where it started, and begin to understand that this is not your fault and this does not make you a bad person. There is also dialectic behavioral therapy that also helps, DBT. We hear DBT a lot when we're talking about BPD, borderline personality disorder, but DBT therapy can also help you when you're dealing with C-PTSD. So this is very important too, because it can really help you deal with the stress and the anxiety and processing that stress, which is a big deal. We got to process that. And also sometimes when we're dealing with complex PTSD, we might actually have thoughts of self-harm too, because we feel so overwhelmed, we don't know how to end the pain. So this can help us as well. So there's a lot of things that we can do, as well as talk therapy to walk through this, but really finding someone that you can trust and walk this journey with is profound and extremely important, because it's not fair to live this life in trauma and fear. Okay, and so when we're dealing with this, it's not a happy environment. Our brain, our like what we're thinking in our mind is not working on positive thought. We're working on negative thought. We're also being hypercritical on ourselves. We're scared, we're fearful, and that is not a good place to be at. So we need to get back into neutral and really try to make these changes and be able to understand where it started, understanding how a lot of this trauma, all of this trauma, was not your fault. Okay, and understanding going back to that beginning and really working through this with someone that's safe and good to work through, and somebody that you can trust and that you can tell these things to, so we can get it out of your mind and begin to eventually stop reliving this day after day after day, because we owe it to ourselves to be able to have some clarity of thought to make the right decisions for ourselves and to choose wisely. And if we're dealing with either PTSD or complex PTSD, we don't have the ability to focus on the necessary choices we need to make because we have so many things going on in our head at one time, okay? And so I would rather have somebody be able to begin to see that the world is not that bad of a place, but when we're dealing with this type of trauma, it's almost impossible to see. I hope this video has helped you, and please share this if you know of anybody that might be dealing with complex PTSD or even PTSD, as well as the previous video that we did on PTSD. This can help someone to understand the situation, understand the symptoms, and understand what they're dealing with in their life. If you're dealing with this, finding someone that can really help you to really go through this process and walk that journey with you is so important, so you can begin to live that life that you deserve. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and give us a like on this video if this video has helped you. Share this with your friends and family who might be dealing with this situation, or anybody that you think might be going through C-PTSD. And on the comment section below, I love to hear from you. I love to hear your perspective and any situations that you've overcome and dealt with. It allows us to learn, and it allows our community to grow stronger. Don't forget to live your true life.